In a room dripping with royal splendor, Princess Anne stood, her voice sharp, her words deliberate. And in a single sentence, she shattered decades of palace silence. It wasn't just a correction, it was a public humiliation for Queen Camilla. The air froze. The war had begun. It had started as a glittering night, the kind the monarchy used to remind the world of its grandeur, crystal chandeliers glowing above, dignitaries from every corner of the globe seated in perfect order, and a sense of timeless elegance cloaking Buckingham Palace. Every detail was orchestrated to reinforce the crown's image of unity and strength. But beneath the polished smiles and measured speeches, the room was already thick with unspoken tensions. When the evening's master of ceremonies rose to acknowledge the royal guests, his words seemed harmless enough until he addressed Camilla as Her Majesty, the Queen, a title meant to elevate, to cement her place beside the king. But before the applause could even begin, Anne's voice cut through the hall. Steady, calm, and lethal. "Queen Consort," she said, correcting him without hesitation. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. Every syllable landed with the weight of royal authority, and in that instant, the entire atmosphere shifted. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks hovered above plates. Even the flicker of candlelight seemed to pause. Camilla's expression didn't change, but her stillness betrayed her. She knew exactly what Anne had just done. This wasn't a misunderstanding, and it wasn't a matter of protocol lost in translation. This was deliberate. In one quiet moment, Anne had drawn a line in front of the world, stripping away the illusion of acceptance and exposing a fracture in the royal family's carefully constructed facade. Dignitaries glanced at one another, unsure if they had just witnessed a subtle joke or the opening blow of something far more serious. But the royals knew. They could feel the current shift. For those familiar with Anne's nature, this was no slip of the tongue. She was not a woman given to careless words. Every statement was measured, calculated, and delivered with the precision of someone who had been raised in the very heart of monarchy. And then, there was Charles. Sitting only a few feet away, the king's hands tightened around the stem of his glass. He didn't look at Anne. He didn't look at Camilla. His gaze seemed fixed on nothing. The practiced neutrality of a man who had spent his entire life mediating between duty and emotion. But inside, there was no denying the weight of the moment. In that single correction, his sister had forced him into a choice he had spent months, perhaps years, avoiding. Defend the woman he loves, or honor the final wishes of the woman who raised them both. No one spoke. No one dared. The silence was louder than any outburst could have been. Camilla lifted her chin, the only outward sign of defiance she could muster in the face of such public challenge. But Anne didn't flinch. She held her composure, her gaze steady, her point made. This wasn't simply about a title. It was a reminder, an assertion of a truth buried under layers of politics, image, and quiet rewriting of history. It was the first move in a battle that had been brewing for years, a battle of loyalty, legacy, and power. And as the soft clinking of silverware slowly resumed, those who truly understood the monarchy knew they had just witnessed something irreversible. The illusion of unity had been broken, and once shattered, it could never be restored to what it was. But to understand why Anne's words carried such deadly precision, we must go back to a promise made in the Queen's final days, and a betrayal years in the making. In the dim light of her private chambers, Queen Elizabeth whispered a truth to her daughter, one the world was never meant to hear. It was not gossip, it was a command. And Anne swore she would carry it to her grave. Until now, the night was quiet, heavy with the weight of endings. The Queen's health had begun to fade, her once tireless presence now confined to moments of stillness, but her mind remained sharp, her gaze unwavering, and in that rare moment alone with her only daughter, she spoke with a clarity that cut through time itself. She told Anne that when the day came, Camilla must only ever be known as Queen Consort. Not queen, not the equal to the sovereign, just consort, an acknowledgement of her role beside Charles, but a deliberate denial of the crown's ultimate title. This was no petty judgment, no fleeting opinion born of personal dislike. It was an unshakable conviction forged from decades of guarding the monarchy's image, preserving its promises, and honoring the bond of trust with the British people. The Queen spoke of Diana not in bitterness, but in reverence. She remembered the public devotion, the national grief, and the unspoken agreement that Diana's place in history could never be overwritten. To call Camilla queen would not simply be a breach of tradition, it would be an erasure, a rewriting of a legacy that still lived in the hearts of millions. Elizabeth made it clear. This was about stability, dignity, and the people's faith in the crown. Anne listened in silence, her heart caught between duty to the institution and loyalty to the mother she revered. She understood the gravity of what was being entrusted to her. This was not a suggestion. This was the Queen's final safeguard against a future she feared might come to pass. And Anne, with her soldier's discipline and unflinching sense of honor, gave her word. She would protect that truth. She would defend that boundary, even if it meant standing against her own brother. When the Queen passed, grief wrapped itself around the palace. The days were filled with ceremonies, tributes, and the inevitable machinery of succession. Charles ascended the throne, and, for a moment, Anne believed her promise was secure. But it began with something small. So small that at first, she thought it was nothing more than an oversight. In the official announcements, the word consort began to vanish. Speeches, press releases, even the palace website referred to Camilla simply as Her Majesty the Queen. No public explanation. No formal declaration. Just a subtle, calculated shift in language that slipped into the nation's consciousness before anyone could question it. Anne's alarm grew with each passing week. She had sworn to uphold her mother's command, but she knew the power of repetition, the way public perception could be shaped quietly until it was accepted as fact. And Camilla, whether through her own will or the influence of those around her, seemed to be stepping fully into the role Elizabeth had forbidden. Anne tried to remain silent, watching, weighing the moment when her intervention would be unavoidable. But the signs were there. Camilla's increasing prominence, the confidence in her public appearances, the unmistakable sense that the line the Queen had drawn was being crossed with deliberate intent. Anne's patience had limits. Her loyalty to her mother's wishes burned hotter with each act that defied them. And so, when the banquet came, and Camilla's title was announced without the word consort, Anne knew the time for quiet vigilance was over. She would speak, she would correct, and she would remind the world of a truth it was never supposed to forget. And yet, this battle was not born in those final moments. It began decades earlier, in a tangle of love, betrayal, and a man who stood between Anne and Camilla. Before Charles, before crowns and titles, there was Andrew Parker Bowles, and for Anne, he was more than a companion. In a life ruled by duty, protocol, and constant scrutiny, he was a rare source of ease. He made her laugh without caution, listened without judgment, and offered her a kind of normality the palace walls could never provide. Their connection was deep, unspoken, yet undeniable, the sort of bond that didn't need declarations to be understood. Friends whispered about the possibility of marriage, of a union that could have brought happiness to the Queen's only daughter. But the monarchy is not built on sentiment. Andrew was Catholic, and under the strict rules of the time, that single fact was enough to make marriage impossible. The decision wasn't made by Anne, nor even by Andrew, it was decided for them, coldly and without room for negotiation. Anne did not fight it publicly. She was a soldier's daughter, raised to understand that personal desires must bend to the needs of the institution, but privately, it cut deep. Letting him go did not mean letting go of the feelings she carried for him. They remained, tucked away where no one could see, preserved in the quiet spaces of her life. For years, Andrew remained a figure in her world, a reminder of what could never be. And then came the blow she had not anticipated: Camilla. When Camilla married Andrew, it was as though an old wound had been reopened, this time by someone who would later claim a place within the royal fold. It wasn't merely that Camilla had married the man Anne could not. It was the ease with which she had done so. No restrictions, no centuries-old rules standing in her way. For Anne, it was a bitter reminder of the unequal weight that royal titles and bloodlines imposed. Camilla had walked into a life Anne had been denied, and she had done so without the cost that Anne had paid. Time passed, but the feeling did not fade. If anything, it deepened when history repeated itself in a far crueler form. Years later, Camilla married Charles, Anne's own brother. This was not just another marriage. This was stepping into the very heart of the family, into the legacy Anne had spent her life defending. For Anne, it was not romance she saw in Camilla's path. It was intrusion. First Andrew, now Charles. Two central figures in her life, claimed by the same woman. It was a pattern she could not ignore. From that moment forward, Anne's opinion of Camilla was fixed. She would be polite when duty demanded it, but she would not extend warmth. There was no malice in her coldness. It was a quiet dismissal, a silent verdict that Camilla had crossed lines too personal, too deeply rooted in history to ever be mended. Even when the cameras caught them together, the stiffness between them was unmistakable. Behind closed doors, Anne did not disguise her lack of respect. She did not seek confrontation, but she did not seek reconciliation either. If the wound had remained personal, perhaps it would have healed, but Camilla's next move would ignite a war of protocol, power, and pride. Anne's refusal to curtsy was not born from stubbornness. It was a calculated strike, backed by centuries of royal precedents. And Camilla knew it. In the labyrinth of royal hierarchy, every gesture carries weight, and every bow or curtsy is more than mere courtesy. It is a public acknowledgement of rank. Tradition dictates that princesses born into the bloodline outrank those who marry into it. For Anne, the only daughter of Queen Elizabeth II, this was not simply a ceremonial quirk. It was an unshakable truth written into the very fabric of the monarchy. By that measure, she was never obliged to lower herself to Camilla, and she made sure the world noticed. At state occasions and formal gatherings, where every royal movement is scrutinized, Anne's posture remained deliberate. While others dipped their heads or bent their knees, she held her ground, moving past Camilla with a grace that masked defiance. It was never loud, it was never messy. But it was visible enough for the press to whisper and for courtiers to take note. And each time, the message was the same. Anne would not grant Camilla the symbolic submission that came with the title Queen. To the public, it might have seemed like a small matter. To those inside the palace, it was a storm contained in a single gesture. For Camilla, the slight was impossible to ignore. She could endure cool glances, polite silences, and even the occasional pointed remark. But this was different. This was Anne challenging her legitimacy without ever uttering a word. Every refusal to curtsy was a reminder of the divide that Camilla, no matter the crown on her head, was still a consort in Anne's eyes, never the sovereign's equal. The more it happened, the more it chipped away at Camilla's carefully crafted image, undermining the quiet campaign to cement her as Her Majesty the Queen in both title and perception. The tension bled into ceremonial protocol. Seating arrangements, processions, and even the order of greetings became silent battlefields. Anne would position herself with precision, never obstructive, but always in ways that reinforced her seniority. She knew exactly where to stand for the cameras, exactly when to move forward, and exactly how to command space without ever breaking decorum. It was a masterclass in royal gamesmanship, and Camilla, who prided herself on surviving palace politics, found herself increasingly boxed in by it. But what stung most was that Anne's defiance was not reckless rebellion. It was rooted in the very laws and customs that Camilla had sworn to uphold. There was no rule Camilla could call upon to force Anne's compliance. Every time Anne withheld a curtsy, she did so with the full protection of royal precedent. Camilla could neither publicly challenge her without appearing petty, nor privately persuade her without admitting insecurity. Yet for Anne, this was never about petty point scoring. It was about the promise she had made to her mother. Every withheld curtsy was a silent reminder of Queen Elizabeth's final command, a quiet rebellion against the creeping erasure of that truth. The Queen had drawn a line, and Anne was making sure it stayed visible, even if she had to fight for it alone. But Anne wasn't fighting this battle alone across the palace. Another figure was sharpening his own quiet war against Camilla. For Prince William, the feud with Camilla was never about politics, it was about his mother. And that wound had never closed. Long before he wore the weight of royal duty on his shoulders, he carried the far heavier burden of watching Princess Diana's life unravel. He had been there, not in the public eye, but in the quiet, unguarded moments when she broke under the strain of betrayal. As a boy, William heard the arguments, saw the tears, and felt the crushing injustice of knowing the woman who was supposed to be his father's confidant was, instead, the source of his mother's deepest pain. Those memories were not easily forgotten. Even as he grew into a man, the echoes of Diana's voice, her warnings, and her raw heartbreak lingered. William made a silent vow. No one would erase her legacy, and no one would rewrite the truth of what she endured. That promise became the lens through which he viewed Camilla, not as a stepmother, not even as a royal figure, but as the person whose presence had forever altered the course of his family's history. Still, William understood duty. For his father's sake, for the stability of the monarchy, he tolerated her. He appeared at the same events, smiled for the cameras, and maintained a cordial distance. But behind the facade, there was no warmth, no trust. It was a fragile truce, built not on forgiveness, but on the mutual understanding that open conflict would fracture the royal family beyond repair. Over time, whispers began to reach him, rumors that Camilla had shared private details about him with select members of the press. They were subtle leaks, the kind that could be brushed aside as speculation. But they painted him as cold, unapproachable, and difficult. For William, the pattern was unmistakable. He had lived through the corrosive power of media manipulation once before with his mother, and he recognized the signs. The idea that Camilla could use the same tools that had tormented Diana only deepened his resentment. Then came the matter of Kate. Camilla's reported view that Kate was not royal enough cut deep, not because it reflected public opinion, but because it felt like history repeating itself. William saw in Kate the same warmth, grace, and quiet strength that had made Diana beloved by the people. And just as the establishment had once tried to undermine Diana, so too did Camilla seem to underestimate Kate's place in the royal family. William responded not with confrontation, but with strategy. He elevated Kate at every opportunity, placing her at the heart of their public image, ensuring that her poise, compassion, and dedication were seen not as novelties, but as the embodiment of the monarchy's future. Every charitable cause, every international engagement, every carefully chosen public moment was part of a broader design to make Kate not just accepted, but irreplaceable. And while William waged a silent campaign, Kate Middleton herself became a threat Camilla could neither ignore nor contain. She entered the palace as an outsider. She now stands as its most beloved figure. And for Camilla, that rise was unbearable. When Kate Middleton first walked into William's life, she was a university student with no royal lineage, no inherited titles, and no training for the relentless spotlight she would one day face. Yet, from the moment the public caught sight of her, something shifted. She carried herself with an ease that made her approachable, but with a quiet elegance that hinted at the potential for something greater. Still, the road ahead was not without its trials. In 2007, the world watched as she and William's relationship appeared to end. The headlines were relentless, dissecting every possible reason, every imagined slight. For many, such public scrutiny would have been crushing. But Kate's response was the first sign of the resilience that would define her. She did not plead for sympathy or retreat into obscurity. Instead, she stepped back into the world with quiet confidence, refusing to appear diminished. That poise didn't just win her public admiration. It caught the attention of those within the palace who understood that grace under pressure was a rare and invaluable trait. It was during this period that Queen Elizabeth's trusted advisor, Samantha Cohen, stepped in. Under Cohen's guidance, Kate underwent a kind of royal apprenticeship. She learned the intricacies of protocol, the balance between warmth and authority, and the skill of navigating political, cultural, and personal tensions without misstep. This was not a superficial education in titles and etiquette. It was a deliberate shaping of a future leader, someone who could stand at the center of the monarchy without being consumed by it. When she eventually married William, Kate didn't simply step into her role, she redefined it. Her focus was clear and consistent: mental health, early childhood development, and youth empowerment. These weren't causes chosen for convenience, they were commitments she invested in deeply, meeting with experts, listening to those affected, and building initiatives with tangible impact. Each engagement, each speech, each project added another layer to her public identity, not just as a princess, but as a woman of substance and purpose. Inevitably, comparisons to Diana grew louder. The warmth, the empathy, the ability to connect with people from every walk of life. It all echoed the qualities that had made William's mother beloved. And for Camilla, already carrying the weight of public skepticism, those parallels were like a shadow she could not step out from. Where Kate's presence seemed to heal old wounds in the public's perception of the monarchy, Camilla's image remained tethered to its most controversial chapter. The tension between them was never openly acknowledged, but there were moments when the undercurrent became visible. One such moment came at a formal event when Kate, in full view of the court, declined to curtsy to Camilla. It was not a clumsy oversight, it was a deliberate choice, executed with the same quiet composure that had become her hallmark. In the rigid world of royal etiquette, it was a gesture that spoke volumes without a single word. Before her death, Queen Elizabeth had made her feelings clear in private. She respected Kate, admired her work ethic, and, perhaps most importantly, believed she represented the monarchy's future. That unspoken endorsement carried a weight Kate never flaunted, but always honored through her conduct. And it was this, her ability to embody duty without arrogance, that made her rise so threatening to those who feared being eclipsed. By now, three forces, Anne's loyalty, William's grudge, and Kate's grace, were converging. And for Charles, the pressure was becoming unbearable. Between the woman he loves and the legacy he swore to protect, King Charles faced a choice that could define or destroy his reign. For decades, he had fought to rehabilitate Camilla's public image, carefully reshaping the narrative around her from scandal to stability. Every step had been deliberate. Gradual introductions into public life, strategic appearances, charity work tailored to soften her profile. It had been a slow, painstaking campaign to turn a figure once reviled into a partner the public could accept as part of the monarchy's future. And by the time the crown was his, Charles believed he had succeeded at least enough to keep the peace. But peace in the palace is fragile, and Charles carried a secret that threatened its very foundation. He had been present when his mother made her wishes clear. Camilla was to be Queen Consort, nothing more. It wasn't a suggestion, and it wasn't rooted in personal dislike. It was the late Queen's way of protecting the monarchy's integrity, of preserving the unspoken agreement with the public that Diana's place in history would not be rewritten. Charles heard those words. He understood their weight, and yet, as king, he quietly allowed the title Consort to disappear, knowing it would be seen as both a victory for his wife and an act of defiance against his mother's decree. His sister's loyalty to the Queen's wishes only deepened his unease. Anne was unyielding, her sense of duty sharper than any personal affection. Confronting her directly risked igniting a family conflict that could spiral into public scandal. But defending Camilla too openly came with its own peril, alienating William and Kate, whose growing influence and public support were essential for the monarchy's stability. Charles knew that William's tolerance of Camilla was not born of reconciliation, but of restraint. To push him too far could fracture the royal image beyond repair. So Charles did what he had always done. In moments of impossible choice, he stalled. He convinced himself that time would soften old grudges, that the dust would settle, and the public would accept the quiet erasure of the Queen Consort title. He hoped that with enough patience, Anne's resistance would fade, William's resentment would cool, and Camilla could step fully into her role without further challenge. But the opposite happened. Every passing month only deepened the fault lines. Anne became more vocal, William more distant, Kate more revered. The monarchy's center of gravity was shifting, and Charles could feel it slipping from his grasp. Then came the banquet. Charles had known the evening would be tense. Camilla's introduction as Her Majesty the Queen was no accident. Yet when Anne interrupted, her correction sharp and deliberate, Charles did nothing. He sat in silence, the weight of his inaction pressing harder than the crown itself. In that moment, he wasn't just a brother or a husband. He was a king, watching his family's unity fracture in front of the world. And then came the night when Anne decided silence was no longer an option, the moment she revealed everything. In the glittering banquet hall, under chandeliers and centuries of tradition, Anne spoke, and in doing so, she pulled the veil from decades of royal deception. The room had been heavy with pomp and ceremony, a parade of polite smiles and diplomatic pleasantries, but beneath it all lay a tension that had been building for months. When Camilla was introduced as Her Majesty the Queen, the words rolled through the hall like a coronation in miniature, the final seal on her rise. Yet before the applause could swell, Anne's voice cut through the air, measured, calm, but carrying the unmistakable weight of truth. Her Majesty, she said, her gaze locked on Camilla, never intended you to be queen. The words fell like a stone into still water, sending shockwaves in every direction. Silence gripped the hall. Forks paused in midair. Diplomatic conversations froze. It was not just what she had said, but the authority with which she said it. Anne's eyes never left Camilla's. They were steady, unblinking. The eyes of someone who had waited for this moment and chosen it with precision. There was no malice in her tone, only finality, as if she were not speaking an opinion, but delivering a verdict long sealed by the late queen herself. Camilla's reaction was as controlled as it was telling. Her lips pressed into a thin smile, her chin lifted just slightly higher. To the casual observer, it might have looked like composure, but those close enough could see it for what it was, a mask. Behind it was a fury she could not show. Not here, not now. Every instinct told her to strike back, but she knew the room was not hers to command in that moment. The weight of Anne's words hung too heavy, the silence too absolute. Guests exchanged glances, uncertain whether they had just witnessed a family dispute or a historic declaration. Royals at the table stiffened, some with eyes cast downward, others watching the exchange with an intensity that betrayed their shock. Even Charles remained motionless, his expression unreadable, as if frozen between the instinct to defend his wife and the knowledge that Anne's words carried the voice of their mother from beyond the grave. The impact of that moment was immediate and irreversible. Anne had done what no one else dared. She had spoken aloud, the truth whispered in corridors and guarded in private diaries. It wasn't just a challenge to Camilla's title. It was a direct reminder to everyone present that the crown's legitimacy is bound by the will of the monarch who came before. And in this case, that will had been clear. The whispers began before the plates were cleared. They would travel from table to table, from guest to guest, then out into the night, where journalists waited for the smallest hint of palace intrigue. By morning, the story would no longer be contained within the palace walls. Anne's words had set something in motion, a slow-burning fire that would find its way into headlines, into drawing room conversations, into the very heart of the monarchy's public image. But even as the dust settled from that night, one final revelation was still waiting, one that could change the monarchy forever. Some secrets can be silenced, others outlive those who kept them. This one was never meant to reach the world, but now it may decide the crown's future. In the days following Anne's public challenge, the palace scrambled to contain the fallout. Yet, behind closed doors, the whispers only grew louder. Trusted aides, those who had served the Queen with unshakable loyalty, began to confirm, in guarded conversations, what many had suspected. They had heard her speak those very words to Anne and others. Camilla was never to be queen, only Queen Consort. It was not an idle remark, but a conviction repeated often enough to ensure it would be remembered when the time came. As the story leaked into the public sphere, something extraordinary began to happen. Public opinion, so often fractured when it came to royal disputes, started to swing in Anne's favor. Her calm authority during the banquet confrontation had struck a chord, painting her not as a sister stirring trouble, but as a custodian of her mother's legacy. Editorials praised her courage, citizens wrote letters in support, and opinion polls reflected a surprising truth. The people were far more aligned with Anne's position than the palace might have anticipated. Rumors began to swirl about a potential royal protocol review. While no formal statement had been made, whispers suggested that behind the palace walls, discussions were taking place about whether Camilla's title should be redefined, restoring the consort designation that had quietly been erased. It was a possibility that, if acted upon, would send shockwaves through the monarchy, rewriting the narrative that had been so carefully crafted since Charles's ascension. All the while, Charles remained silent. His stillness in the face of mounting media pressure only deepened the intrigue. Was he biding his time, weighing the impossible choice between his wife's dignity and his mother's command? Or was his silence a shield, a way of avoiding a confrontation that could split the family and the nation alike? The press demanded answers, but none came. And in that absence, the speculation grew unchecked. In stark contrast, William and Kate's public image soared. Their appearances in the weeks following the incident were met with overwhelming crowds and glowing coverage. They were seen not just as the monarchy's future, but as its moral compass, steady, principled, and untarnished by the bitter divisions gripping the palace. Every warm handshake, every empathetic smile, every carefully chosen word only amplified the contrast between their growing popularity and the shadow hanging over Charles and Camilla. Now, the question loomed larger than ever. Would Charles honor his mother's wishes and preserve the promise made to the nation? Or would he choose to stand by Camilla, even if it meant rewriting history to suit the present? The weight of that decision was more than personal. It was constitutional, cultural, and deeply symbolic. The monarchy's credibility, its image, and perhaps even its unity hung in the balance. The palace gates remain closed, but the battle inside is far from over. And for the first time in decades, the future of the crown is uncertain. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.